Good evening, everyone. How are we all this fine, fine night? This wintry night that we've bypassed autumn and went straight to the chill. I hope you're all doing great. Usual spiel, let us know in the chat who you are, where you're from, and what you like to get up to. No, let us know what you're studying, where you're studying, if you're a practice educator, where you are in the country. And since tonight is about finding principles for excellent practice, tell us something you've found this week or last week that's made you happy.
So tonight we are looking at, we're doing a back to basics session. We've got a couple of back to basics sessions coming up. The back to basics sessions are normally the most popular, so that's interesting that we've got quite a low number tonight, and maybe that's because it's not hugely clear what we're going to cover, but we're going to be just looking at finding principles for excellent practice, going back to basics. It is our 96th webinar, so we've got only 4 webinars left now, and then people will be able to watch them all back on YouTube, but we won't be here every Wednesday night from November. So we're on countdown now, aren't we? So we're going to be looking at how we find principles for excellent practice as social workers in this back to basics session. So I'm going to start off, because it's a back to basics, with what do we mean by principles? You know that I like to start off by looking at the kind of dictionary definition of a word when I'm exploring a word. And principle, the dictionary definition, is up on screen now. It's a fundamental truth or a proposition that serves as the foundation for a system of belief or behavior, or for a change of reasoning. It's basically the foundations of social work. Principles are our foundations, essentially. That's what we mean by principles. Now, we've done some webinars in the past where we've looked at things like values and ethics and talked about the difference between an ethic and a principle. And if I'm honest, it's often been very confusing for people. Well, I found some of them confusing. They've not all been team-led. Sometimes it's when we've had guests in who've been quite academic and talked about the differences. For me, principles are just the basic foundations. They're just the foundations of our practice. And if we go right back to the foundations, then BSTEC's first 7 principles BSTEC came up with, he was actually a Catholic priest. And I think the reason that I'm saying that is because I do think it's important sometimes to recognize that some of these principles that we're based on as social work, there's a lot of link to spirituality, and just being conscious of that and aware of that, I think, is very important. He did become a professor of social work, and in the 1960s, he defined 7 principles that underpinned a positive relationship between what he referred to as between social worker and client. And they are considered to be the foundations of the professional value base in social work. Firstly, he talked about individualization, the person being treated as a unique individual. Purposeful expression of feelings, the person having the opportunity to express their feelings. Controlled emotional involvement, the person should have a sympathetic response from an interested professional who adopts a certain level of emotional involvement. Acceptance, the person should be seen as a person of worth. Non-judgmental attitude, the person shouldn't be judged by the worker. Self-determination, the person should be able to make choices and decisions. And confidentiality, the person has a right to professional confidentiality. So those 7 were, right back in the 1960s, the basic principles of social work. We've got a couple of other ways of looking at principles. The International Federation of Social Workers has their statement of ethical principles. They call it ethical principles, and they've got 9. Recognition of the inherent dignity of humanity. They've got promoting human rights, promoting social justice, promoting the right to self-determination, promoting the right to participation, respect for confidentiality and privacy, treating people as whole persons, ethical use of technology and social media, and professional integrity. So they are the 9 statements, they're the 9 principles in the International Statement of Ethical Principles. Then if we look at our own setting, we've got the British Association of Social Workers. They have a number of principles. So their code of ethics has 3 values, and each of those values is broken down into principles. So there's human rights, social justice, and professional integrity. And the principles: upholding and promoting human dignity and well-being, respecting the right to self-determination, promoting the right to participation, working holistically, identifying and developing strengths, challenging oppression, respecting diversity, distributing resources, challenging unjust policies and practices, working in solidarity, upholding the values and reputation of the profession, being trustworthy, maintaining professional boundaries, making considered professional judgments, and being professionally accountable. You could take all 3 of those, the 1961 principles by BISTEC, the IFSW statement principles, and the BASWA principles, and cross-reference them all. What you'll see is they're incredibly similar. They might use different terminology. They might talk about working holistically rather than seeing someone as a whole person. They're going to use different language, but essentially the principles are absolutely foundational. They are just the foundations of what we do. So I was thinking, okay, how do we bring this to life? How do we make this more meaningful, especially for people who are perhaps at the early stages of your professional career? Maybe you're just on placement, or maybe you're a practice educator wanting to help people to think through the principles of practice in social work. So I was trying to toy around with, what are we going to do here? How are we going to do it? And one of the things that struck me was about spellings. And I think as I was thinking about, I think one of the things that happened was over the summer when we were planning the sessions and the team said we need a few back to basics. And I was thinking, I'll just throw in a heading, finding principles of good practice, and then I'll decide what to do. And then just recently I've been having to think, what am I going to do on finding principles of good practice? And I think somebody sent me something where they'd spelt principle incorrectly, or they'd actually used the wrong word. There's 2 words in English that sound the same, but actually mean different things and are spelt different. So there's principle, which is what we're talking about tonight, which is spelt, finishes off with an LE. That's the standard or the foundations. Then there's also principle, but it's spelt principal, so it ends AL, and that means the main or most important. In England, we have principal social workers. Principal social workers is spelt with the AL. It's like the main social worker in the organisation. It's not spelt with the LE. It's not the foundations. It's not the principles. So I thought, well, it's a bit about spellings here. So I was going to start the session and end the session thinking about spellings around principles of excellent practice, really. And I thought, right, I'm going to spell out the word practice, but drawing in on principles. So a bit like our A to Zs, often very popular. I'd like you to get working in the chat. If I said to you, I'm going to use a word that for me is a key principle, it begins with the letter P, because that's practice. And then there'll be one that begins with the letter R, because that's the next word in practice. So what you're going to give me, what do you think I have selected as, for me, one of the most important principles, or if you like, foundations of social work practice that begins with the letter P? It may or may not have already been mentioned in the 3 that I've taken you through. I've taken you through the formal, the academic, if you like, principles, the principles that we would refer to in assignments. I've spelt those out for us, but now we're going to spell out maybe something slightly different. So I can't see in the chat. Well, I can if I pull it up. Okay, so we've got a couple of P's there. We've got professionalism, person-centered, privacy. Yeah, we've already talked about the importance of privacy in some of the principles, haven't we? So definitely they are there. So what else we got? Personalization, person-centered, a lot about persons, a lot about people. Which is key, isn't it? Partnership, brilliant. People, we're getting lots of P's going in the chat now. Let me tell you what I went for. Didn't go for people at all. You might think people would be the starting point, but I've actually gone for purpose. And I've gone for purpose. I'm going to spell out practice using some of the principles, but I'm doing this to try and connect theory and reflection, and actually, I suppose, in some ways, revisit some of the things that we've done in previous webinars as a back to basics. And for me, I think purpose is one of the basic foundations or principles of social work practice. Being clear about what is the purpose of your work, what's the purpose of your role, purpose of the relationship that you're building. I've been watching Community Care Live tweets today. Kai was fortunate enough to be there in person, so he might tell you in the chat what it was like, but I was watching it, watching some of the tweets, and I saw somebody say, you know, we've got to move on from social work just being about building relationships. It's got to be about, there was some comment, I think it was a criticism really of social work and relationships, and it made me really cross, because I was thinking, we don't just go out just to make relationships with people for the sake of it. The relationships have a purpose. There's a purpose in the relationship. Professional relationships have purpose. Working with people has purpose. So what's the purpose of the task? How do you find purpose and meaning in every aspect of your role? Because this is really, really important. And I know I go on about this framework all the time. You've seen this slide so many times, but I thought I'm going to revisit this tonight, because last week in our FGM webinar, Maureen quite rightly said, don't ask people who are affected by FGM why. Just don't ask any questions that start with why. And the team were like, Siobhan always says ask why, always says why. And then I was thinking about, yeah, but I don't mean in that context. When I'm thinking about why questions, for me, the why questions are what we ask ourselves. They're what go on in our head. We don't necessarily ask the why questions out loud. So I talk about the what, why, how framework as, when you're working with somebody, you need to be able to say to me as a supervisor, what's happening for this person you're working with? Why do you think this situation has come about for them? How are you going to work with them to bring about change or improved outcomes, or even how you're going to work with them to maintain the situation sometimes? There's always going to be a what, why. Ask people why. You don't have to ask people why, but you need to understand why. As a practice educator, if I'm coming out to do an observation of your practice and you're a student, if I say to you, tell me why are we doing this piece of work, don't say back, it's a stat visit, or it's an annual review, or it's a I don't know, whatever kind of meeting you want to describe it as. That's what it is. That's not why we're doing it. That's not the purpose. So you've got to drill deeper. What's the purpose of this meeting? What's the purpose of this assessment? You need to find your purpose. And purpose is key, really important. And my fear is that the why question is slowly falling off the social work professional agenda. It used to be there all the time. Students used to ask me all the time, why do you think that? They don't say that anymore now. Students are much more likely to say, what form do I fill in? How do I do this? What do I need to do next? There's a lot of what and how. Always ask why, because it's an incredibly powerful question of other professionals, not necessarily of people that you're supporting. In fact, rarely of people that you're supporting. This guy is Simon Sinek. You may have come across his work. He's one of the most influential writers around the world of leadership. If you are in social work in England, then you are working with the Professional Capabilities Framework. The 9th domain of the Professional Capabilities Framework is about leadership, because there's a recognition that essentially social work is leadership in the community. So it's worth looking at some leadership literature and leadership theory. And Simon Sinek, nothing to do with social work, but he's really well known in the world of leadership. He's got one of the most watched TED Talks of all time, for example. And his approach is called entire leadership. His theory is called the golden circle. And the golden circle is essentially he says that every organization on the planet knows what they do. the products they sell or the services they provide. He's talking about organizations. He says some organizations know how they do it, the things that set them apart from their competition, their unique selling point. But his claim is that very few organizations know why they do what they do. Why isn't about making money. He says that's a result. He says why is a purpose, a cause, a belief. Why is the very reason that the organization exists. I used to read Simon Sinek's work and think, do you know what? Social work, we're sorted. We've got our why. We know our why. But over time, I think we are losing sight of why are we social workers? I hear all of the time people saying, this isn't why I became a social worker. This isn't why I became a social worker. But when I ask them, why did you? They're not as able to articulate that. So those of you who are new to the profession, those of you who are students, keep hold of your why, because why you want to be a social worker, golden bit, it sits in the middle. So purpose is the beginning of finding the principles of excellent practice. What do you think the R is going to be? Let's have a go in the chat at what the R might stand for, what you're going to get with your R, because I'm spelling out the word practice. So we've done the P. Where's your R? Respect. Thank you, Catherine. Fabulous, really important. Relationship-based, robust relationships. Again, respect. So important. Responsibility. Reflect. I think I've seen reflect a couple of times now. I did go for reflection for the second principle, reflection. And the reason I've done this, because we're on a Back to Basics webinar tonight, the reason I've done this is because so many times people see reflection as something that's got to be done for assignments. I've got to write this reflection. You've got a problem, because reflection is about much more than writing essays. Reflection is a key aspect of self-care and thriving as a social worker. In pulling these principles together, I wanted to kind of, I suppose, summarize some of the webinars that we've done and feedback on some of those. We have done so many webinars on reflection because the original idea of the webinars coming together. So we've done so many webinars on reflection, and yet still the most watched session on reflection is the reflective writing one. Way ahead of anything else, 20-odd thousand views for reflective writing. But when we're talking about reflective practice and building reflective practice and all of those other webinars, reflective journaling, nowhere near the same amount of watchbacks. People associate reflection with writing, and it should be just key. You know, it provides us a way of exploring the principles that underpin our practice. It is the foundation, it's the building blocks. So keep hold of reflection in everything that you do. Never lose it. Never lose the purpose of your work, and never lose reflection on what's going on and on practice. This is one of my favorite quotes about reflection from Biggs, written at the turn of the century. So, you know, more than 20 years ago, but it's a brilliant quote still. And Biggs says, look, reflection in a mirror is an exact replica of what's in front of it. But reflection in professional practice gives back not what it is, but what it might be, an improvement on the original. How might things look? It's really important for us to reflect in depth and to keep hold of that. And I'm going to end the session tonight with something that I found as a really beautiful reflection tool for myself. So P and R, purpose and reflection. What about the A? What do you think we might have in the A in terms of building this practice? Oh, agility. I'm loving that, Augustus. I think that's very relevant, isn't it? As social workers, don't think of it though. I always think of agility as like doing forward rolls and that in PE classes. Autonomy, approach, accountability, anxiety, anti-oppression, acceptance, approach. We've got a lot of things going on there. Art, I like that, Saeed. The anxiety one, I think it's a biggie in social work work, especially for social work students, but I don't think it's a principle of practice, maybe a principle of excellent practice. Anti-racism, hugely important, absolutely. So what I've gone for in the A is I went for action, because actually for me, principles are based on action. There's a Bananarama song, if you're as old as me. I almost feel like I need to sing you this quote, but I won't, because you won't like my singing voice. But it's not what you do, it's the way that you do it. That's what gets results. Do you remember Bananarama? Brilliant song, but totally true. Kind of like the Maya Angelou quote, you know, that we're always referencing about people will forget what you said, they will forget what you did, they will never forget how you made them feel, how you act. Some of the key things that we need to draw on in terms of principles are based on action. We've talked in these webinars about the vital importance of hope in social work. Hope is action. We've talked about professional love and kindness. Love is action. Social work is action. It has to be about action. It's got to be about what we do. Yes, we can have social work activists, and social work activists are very important, but even if we're not an activist, we need to think about what we do in practice is key. Really important, that A. And I've tried to think about what can I pull together around each of these principles, and I've gone for acts of self-care, and maybe in a way that might relate into that anxiety thing, I don't know, but I've gone for acts of self-care. What do you do as an act of self-care? Some of the things that are going in on the slide at the moment now are some acts of self-care that social workers find really helpful, and we've referred to these in our self-care webinar. I'm just thinking the top one is belting out a song at the top of your voice in the car, and Chris says she's got the Bananarama song in her head now. So Chris, if you want to put your mic on and belt it out, that would be an act of self-care, but clearly not. So I think the action part is about looking after yourself as well as looking after other people, and we need to do that. It should sit within principles of professional practice, because if we run out of support, we can't support others. You know, if we run out of, if we're not looking after ourselves, then we're not looking after other people. Natalie's got straight in on it. She's like, I'm done with the A, I'm straight into the C now already. And I love that. So Natalie's gone in with the C. We've got critical practice, we've got communication. People are getting into this now. You're getting ready for it. You know what's coming. Compassion. These are really important things, you know. Oh, I'm being told here, Chris, you've got a lovely voice. We need some karaoke later then. We've got care, we've got crisis, we've got curiosity. I do think curiosity is a real key one. So we need that whole, what is the letter C in terms of principles, co-production, continuity, curiosity. I actually went for connections. For me, connections are key. All of the things that you're putting into the chat, they're all really important principles for practice. And one of the reasons that we do this and say, what word do you think? What word do you think? Is really about getting you involved and getting you to think about your principles for effective, excellent practice. My principles are based around connections. It's no mistake that we are called Social Work Student Connect. From the start, I wanted the word connect into whatever we did as a team together. Connections are so important in every aspect of social work practice. Connections are about relationships. How do we connect with people? Connections about how do we connect theory with our practice? How does what's happening for this individual connect to their community, their society, to the poverty that they're living in, to politics that we're working within, to the culture and context of our practice? Connections are so important. And actually, the principles that I'm outlining tonight are all about connections. So, for example, connecting theory with practice. There's been, you know, we're going to talk a bit about theory and practice, and I've tried to pull some theory in. They're also connected together. So, for example, our reflection, which was the R, should lead to action, which was the A, and the connection is there, which is the C. Connection is key. So let me pose a question to you then. What's the most important principle in social work practice? The absolute vital, most important principle, single most important principle. What is it? It doesn't have to be part of the spelling of practice, by the way. It could just be, I thought, oh, there's one I can't fit in with spelling, so it's just the most important thing. Could be just anything. Beverly's going for honesty there. Thank you. We've got kindness from Helen. We've got values. We've got trust, empathy, integrity, being human, intentions, good intentions. All of those, they all connect. All of those connect together. I don't think we can put one above another, above another. I think they all connect. Every one of these principles that we're talking about connect. If you don't do one, then there'll be loads of others that you don't do. You know, if your practice educator is concerned about one area of practice, it's very likely that it's impacting on all of the others, because social work skills and principles and values are connected. So we've done P, R, A and C. T comes next. What we're having in T. What are we going to go for in T? I think I saw somebody saying trustworthy earlier, so that could be the T. So yeah, Dave's going in with trustworthy. Natalie's going with time. People who receive services say is so important. We've got trust, we've got transparent, we've got time, technicalities. I'm going to go with theory, and I'm going with theory because it's one of the connections. It's so important. Theory informed practice is really key. The original aim of these webinars was to help people to connect theory with their practice in an accessible way. Practice which has no theory is just potentially quite dangerous. You don't really know why you're doing what you're doing. What's the basis of your practice if there's nothing behind it? So theory is really important. And I know I go on about this all the time. What is a theory and all of that? I talk about it all the time. If you remember, in science, a theory is said to do 4 things. A theory is said to describe a situation, explain it, why it's come about, predict what might happen next. And then in science, a theory is said to control a situation, to bring about change. You will often see this used in lectures, in the introduction to pretty much every theory textbook, as this is what a theory does, this is what you do, and therefore you're using theory all the time. However, I disagree with that on a range of levels. One thing I would disagree with is the use of the word control to say that that's what we do as social workers. There is an element of control in a lot of contemporary practice, and we need to own up to that. But if we change that word to intervene and bring about change, for me, it would sit comfortably that that's what we do as social workers. When we're doing an assessment, we're describing what's happening, we're explaining why it's happening, and we're predicting what's going to happen next. And then we look to, if it's necessary, intervene and bring about change. So we've got those 4, but actually, that's in science. In social work, a theory doesn't do all 4 of those things, as you know, because we've covered this many times. A theory helps us to understand a situation. That's what it does. It's not about what we're doing. It just helps us to do the first 3 of that science framework. It helps us to describe, explain, and predict. So in terms of principles, a theory could help us to understand what the principles of good practice are, because that's what a theory does. It helps us to understand. Models guide our intervention. Models are about what we actually do in practice. So a model could help us to put the principles into practice. Methods are a specific tool or technique that we use in our practice. So we could use methods as specific techniques to put the principles into practice. And an approach is our overall way of going about something. So the question in terms of principles is, is your approach to practice based on a specific principle? So are you, for example, taking a human rights-based approach to practice? Are you taking a hopeful approach to practice? Are you taking a relationship-based approach to practice, a holistic approach to practice? Pick out some of those principles that absolutely influence everything that you do as a practitioner, and that's your approach. So principles and theory are fully connected together, totally connected, and so become really important. But also, I love this quote, and especially when we think about, I mean, I think theory is vital. Theory is really important. It's probably the main area of my work, is writing about and helping people to understand theory and its application to practice. And yet still, I absolutely love this quote that's attributed to Carl Jung. Whether it's true that he said it, I don't know, but I love the phrase: know all the theories, master all the techniques, but as you touch a human soul, be just another human soul. And that's a key part of principled practice, that human connection that we need to make with another person. So I'm hoping that you can begin to see how all of these principles are connected together. We've got 3 letters left. We've got I, C, and E. So what do you think the I is going to be? Do you want to give me in the chat, what's the letter I going to be? We've got intervention, we've got integrity, we've got insight, identity. These are all, see, if you could see my notebook, so many of these words were in my notebook, and then they get scribbled out because I'm like, how do I connect it all together and which one's more important, and ask all those questions. But we've got inclusivity, individuality, individualization. Incredible. I think social work often is, David. Absolutely. Deborah's just going with just I. Absolutely. Really important stuff. I actually went for integrity. I went for integrity because I just think it's an aspect of principles that we really need to, there's almost no other way of describing it, you know, and I think integrity covers so many different aspects of the principles of professional practice. And it's in all of the principles. I mean, you know, if you go back to that Baswa Code of Ethics, the whole of the 3rd value is all about integrity, and it breaks down what integrity means. It's about upholding values, being trustworthy, maintaining boundaries. It's all of those different things. To me, integrity is sometimes can be difficult to really, you can tell when someone doesn't have integrity. It's very easy to tell that, but it can be difficult to really get hold of what does integrity actually mean. And to me, integrity is all about looking in on yourself, thinking about your own professional integrity and personal integrity. So I find attribution theory can really help with this. And this is a back to basics session. People often want to know about theory in these back to basics sessions. And last week I saw references in the chat to blaming bias, which I thought was really interesting. I think that blaming bias, and seeing the explanation of it too, is actually a way of describing attributional bias. And I thought it'd be worth us, because there was a bit of a chat about, a bit in the chat last week about attributional bias. I thought it'd be worth us using theory to create some connections, because I'm trying to make all of these fit together. And so I thought we could look at attribution theory, because attribution theory is basically about whether we internalize or externalize other people's behavior. So effectively, it's about where do we lay the blame. And this could be key around thinking through integrity. So let me try and explain it to you in a straightforward way. I think attribution theory is a brilliant theory. I think we can take it into thinking about attributional bias, think it's brilliant, great. I can't really write about it in a way that's that understandable. And I know when I read back what I've written about it, I don't think it's that clear. I think it's one of those theories that's really hard to explain in writing. But when you use analogies, it works. So attribution is basically about, do we internalize behavior or do we externalize behavior? And the theory is the idea, the theory drawn from psychology is that ordinary attributions are that we externalize our own behavior, but we internalize the behavior of other people. So imagine this. The photo on there is supposed to be the most complex roundabout in the United Kingdom. So I chose that. I can't remember where it is now. I think it might have been in Swindon. I can't remember. Some of you might know. I can't remember. But it was on Google Images as the most complex roundabout in the United Kingdom. I want you to imagine you're on that roundabout. You're on a really complex roundabout. What happens is if you end up in the wrong lane of the roundabout, you think to yourself, this roundabout's really badly signposted. It's an incredibly complex roundabout. It's really difficult to navigate. It's the roundabout's fault if you're in the wrong lane. But if you're in the right lane and somebody else is in the wrong lane, the ordinary attribution apparently is that you will say they're a really bad driver they are. They can't get themselves in the right lane of the roundabout. It's all their fault. It's down to them. You've internalized their behavior. It's their problem. But your behavior is always for a reason. It's always externalized. And you get a lot of that. And I think professional integrity is about recognizing when we have responsibility. It is about recognizing that. It's not about self-blame, but it is about recognizing. And it's why theory and anti-oppressive practice become so vitally important. Because othering is key here. When somebody is similar to us, the theory goes, we're more likely to be able to externalize their behavior. So imagine me driving, okay? I'm on that really complicated roundabout. I'm driving my car and I'm in the right lane. I look to my side, there's somebody who's very clearly in the wrong lane, but she's like a middle-aged woman. She looks like she's in the middle of a hot flush and she's driving an old banger of a car. And I think, oh, she looks a bit like me. It's a really badly signposted roundabout this. I'll just let her in, because she's like me. But on another occasion, I look to my side, and this time it's a young lad in a souped up car, and he's got all fancy wheels, and he's making the car, making loads of noise. And I think to myself, if he thinks he's getting in here, he's got another thing coming. He thinks they think they're in the road, those BMW drivers. It's a blaming thing. He's different to me, so it's all his fault. They're the same as me. It's probably the roundabout's fault. It's about whether we internalize or externalize, and that is really linked into our integrity. Integrity is about looking in. Brené Brown, whose work I absolutely love, I think her latest book, Atlas of the Heart, is amazing. Brené Brown says this of integrity. She says, integrity is choosing courage over comfort. Choosing what's right over what's fun or fast or easy. And it's choosing to practice our values rather than simply professing them. Integrity is key in social work. It's one of the foundations. We're going on to the final two letters. What have you got for C? What have you got for the letter C? Now, we've already had one letter C, haven't we? Because practice has got two C's in it. So you could just churn out what you had before. That wasn't there. So curiosity, care, compassion, all the things that you said earlier could still be there. Creativity, compassion, all of those C's. Lots of compassion. Community, I like that one. Still not any of the C's that I went for though. Really important C's, but I went for, Hayley did it, I went for challenging. I looked earlier at acts of self-care. We've thought about that. Take a look at the sentence on screen. I wrote it on my revision card things this morning. What might it mean? Could mean different things. And it's all about the emphasis on words. Social work is challenging. It is challenging. It's really difficult sometimes. It is a really challenging profession. Or it could be social work is challenging. Because social work should be about challenging. It should be about challenging others. So it's all about the way you say it. And there's another one. I'm sure that was in the Bananarama song as well. It's not what you say, it's the way that you say it. I mean, we've got full-on Bananarama going on tonight. So it is all about social work is challenging. back to those basic principles, back to IFSW statement. 4 of the 9 start off with promoting human rights, promoting social justice. It's in the promoting that we often need to challenge. We have to challenge others to make sure people do have their human rights. We have to challenge to make sure that we bring social justice about. And for me, key theory around challenging is Prospera Tedam's 4D2P model. Now, Prospera did a webinar for us on this. I think it was called Continuing the Conversation Around Anti-Oppressive Practice. And she covered the 4D2P model. And for me, it's one of the webinars I've learned the most from. Brilliant model. Prospera says, in discussion with people, we might discover oppression that they're facing. We need to decide what kind of oppression it is. Is it covert? Is it overt? What form of oppression is it? Is it racism, sexism, ageism, homophobia? But then the key is we have to disrupt that, the challenging. The 4th D is what are you doing to disrupt it? And what I think is brilliant, absolutely brilliant about this model is so helpful at getting us to think about the difference between being non-oppressive and being anti-oppressive. Anti-oppressive practice has to be one of our key principles. And yet so many times when social workers talk to me about being anti-oppressive, or when students have written in a reflective account or in an assignment, I was anti-oppressive here, and I'll say to them, great, how were you anti-oppressive? How were you anti-oppressive? And what they say is, well, I didn't oppress the person. No, what they were doing was, I was non-oppressive. I didn't oppress the individual. That's not anti-oppressive. Anti-oppressive is when you disrupt it, when you challenge the oppression, when you do something to change the oppression. And again, one of my favorite quotes, Angela Davis, I'm no longer accepting the things I cannot change. Instead, I'm changing the things that I cannot accept. And I think that that's almost got to be a bit of a mantra really for social work. That's what we've got to do. We've got to challenge this stuff. Sometimes we have to challenge it by coming together, by connecting together. Can't always challenge effectively alone, but we can challenge a lot when we're together. So we've got one more letter left. We've got the letter E left to spell out the word practice. What have you got for me in the letter E? If we're thinking about principles, look, Natalie's got herself ready to throw it in the chat because she had a pile of E's there and it went straight in. So we've got ethics, empathy, effective, embrace, ethical. We've got empowerment, eloquently challenging. I like that. Empathy, equality, loads of E's. Some brilliant E's. Equal. Like that one, elevate, excitement, brilliant. Got lots of really good E's there. Again, not one of the E's that I went for. Education, that's also really helpful. I love the way, I don't know why mine are always a bit different than we've got in the chat, but that's fine. It's great. It's really good that we've all got different things. I actually went for, in the E, I went for environment. I was thinking about a person in environment perspective is a key thing that we need to do as social workers. It's systems theory, isn't it? We're thinking systemically here, but the person in environment perspective is key. It's really what sets us apart from other people. You remember that roundabout? Well, ordinary attributions apparently are that you blame other people for their behavior. So we blame the driver for being in the wrong lane. But you know what? We don't, as social workers. We challenge those ordinary attributions. We don't blame the driver. We look at the driver and the roundabout because we look at the environment. And that's what we do that's different to what anybody else does. Kultuma is now a social worker in schools. When you're in schools, you're looking at the school environment, you're looking at the home environment, you're looking at everything. But other professionals don't. Other professionals don't do that. Other professionals have a teacher looks at this child in the classroom. I don't know, trying to think of other professionals and what their view is, but we see, you know, I don't know, doctors see the person in the hospital bed. We don't see, other people don't see that impact of environment, and is so important. The significant connections that we can create here, that person in environment perspective. The little picture on the slide here is basically systems theory in a picture, seeing the person in the context of their relationships, their community, their society. It's almost like the PCS analysis in a picture, isn't it? Neil Thompson's PCS analysis when we're looking at anti-oppressive practice. But I think it's also important to look at yourself as a social worker in the team, organisation, and wider profession. So seeing yourself in that context is really important. And environment means a lot more. There is some early stage movement in social work into green social work or environmental social work. Got to look to the future of social work. Where are we going as social workers in the future? I've been a social worker for 32 years. In 32 years' time, social work is going to look very different than it does now. And we need to look at how it's going to look. And a lot of it should be connected into the environment. Think about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, because that should be a key thing that you're referring to as social workers. These are underpinning everything that the International Federation of Social Workers is doing at the moment. And this is one of the UN development goals that has been broken down into those that are about the environment, those that are about social, and those that are about governance. And if you look at not just the social ones, because they're very key for social work, but also the environment ones, they're also key for social work. And with the huge cost of living crisis that's coming, we need to be prepared to be thinking about food security. We need to be thinking about the environmental issues. We need to be thinking about energy. We need to be thinking about fuel poverty. All this stuff is going to impact on social work. So thinking ahead and thinking about environmental practice is really important. So where do we find the principles of good practice? That's the question. Where do we find the principles of good practice? Well, it should be in our practice. It should be in your practice. It should be in my practice. It's all about practice, isn't it? And so if we kind of summarize what we've looked at, I've demonstrated the principles from IFSW and from BASWA and so on. But for me, it all ties together in being clear about the purpose of our work, in continual reflection, in taking action, in making connections and seeing connections, in using theory, in having integrity, in challenging when we need to challenge, and in thinking about the environment on a range of different layers. But I said we were going to start with some spelling issues and finish with some spelling issues, and we are not quite finished, but almost as we come to the end. Sometimes I see people spelling practice with an S, and I'm never really sure where that comes from. And it's quite often academics that do that, if I'm honest. Practice or practice, is it C or is it S? And so I've tried to look up what's the difference. And essentially, practice is a noun. It's a naming word. It's the way we name something. Whereas practice with an S is a verb, which is a doing word. So the S is all about the doing. And the S is basically skills. And really, social work and social work education in particular is about developing the skills to put the principles that we've looked at tonight into practice. And I'm hoping that as a back to basics, it's helped us to think about some of those basics, some of the things that underpin what we do, right back to the basics. Because sometimes we get so tied up in the complexity, we forget about the person and environment perspective. We forget about the need to challenge, you know, we forget about the theory. And sometimes just revisiting those basics is really important. I want to end the webinar tonight, though, slightly differently than I ordinarily do. And it's because I wanted to reflect back in a way on when we started these webinars. We're coming towards the end. You know, we're starting to think about how do we disengage from this? We'll be, you know, we won't be seeing one another as team members every week anymore and so on. And when we started these webinars, it was in the first UK COVID lockdown when placements had been suspended and people were left isolated. You know, when we started, Chris and Kat were students and, you know, they're now qualified social workers, and Chris is now just starting to be on her journey towards being a practice educator, and she's supporting a student in placement. So it shows how long we've been doing this and how long we've been around. I've come across a poem maybe about 6-8 months ago. It was written about COVID, but as I listened to it, I recognised it as a social worker. And I thought this poem has been basically written about my career in social work and what I've learned as a social worker. I genuinely believe it could have been written about our work. And so creating that connection between we started this because of COVID, this poem was written because of COVID, and the challenges often provide us with clarity. So I'm going to stop the screen sharing because we need to share differently to make sure that everybody will be able to see and hear the poem. I'm hoping that you will. If you don't have time to stay and listen to it, then, you know, the webinar is over. It is just this poem, and then we'll put the links in for next week. But if you're going to leave already, I'll tell you next week is we've got our Soyeb, a returning speaker who's going to be talking to us about spirituality in social work, and it's a brilliant webinar. So we invited him back because he was a 10-minute guest once and people wanted to know more, and that's why he's coming back. So if you want to register for that, I think the team will be putting it in the chat now. I'm going to conclude with this poem. It's a very reflective poem. I see in it social work. I want to maybe ask you and invite you to think about what you see in it. It's all about what we learn. And I suppose what I'd say to you is, how would you describe the key learning that you've had as a social worker?